Feds like, come on, let's talk. CIAF, we enter and spy. When we fly, deny.
Good to see you. Good to see you. As always. You know, with a lot of the work that you do and that I do, we've been countering hegemonic or grandmaster narratives around the relationship between the countries that we live in and the countries that our families are from. Yeah. And a lot of the, whether it be the arms deals or the corporate relationships between governments and war, right? So in this case, if we're talking directly about BP and Iraqi culture or Iraqi survival, you know, how would you say that BP has been destructive to the nation?
Okay, well, so first in understanding this, we need to look at BP's interests as intimately linked to British government interests. Now, the Undersecretary for the Foreign Office, Michael J., 48 hours before the invasion went ahead, met with the chairman of BP. And for those that would say, well, that doesn't necessarily bear any relationship to the invasion, if you actually look at the amount of people that were predecessors to Michael J. in his position at the Foreign Office that went in the kind of incestuous and revolving door relationship between oil and gas companies and that role in the Foreign Office, 4 out of 5 of the next people in his role literally went directly into jobs in those kind of companies. If we look at the way that BP, the IMF and the US government, particularly in 2007, were pushing for something called the oil law, the hydrocarbon law, what that would have enabled the companies to do would be to sign production sharing agreements with the Iraqi government. What that would have meant is that the oil fields that were then essentially sold off to those companies would be in almost indefinite possession of those companies. Minimum 20 to 40 years would be those contracts. Often we see on the oil rigs, foreign employees are employed. Often we see these companies having very little consideration for the environment around them. We know that fossil fuels are, and this is something that is the consensus with 97% of climate scientists are very clear that fossil fuels are causing climate change. The fossil fuel industry in general is subsidized to the tune of $5 trillion per year, and that's by all the governments in the world, a number that, obviously the worst offenders are the US government, the Chinese and the Russian government. That adds up to around $13.6 billion per day that the fossil fuel industry receives. You have to look at who were the companies that won the contracts without bids. So the companies that won contracts without bids for the quote-unquote reconstruction of Iraq. And it's important we understand that while there is a military-industrial complex, there's a military-industrial destruction-construction complex.
Of course.
So while at the same time you can have a company like BAE Systems profit massively off of the weapon sales, on the other side of that,
construction companies and
exactly.
Halliburton and
precisely, you look at Kellogg Brown Root, they actually won the biggest unbidded contract in US history. It was a massive figure. And also BP were awarded unbidded contracts, as well as Bechtel. And so it was really clear from the beginning, if you look at the internal memos between Jack Straw and between other figures, Tony Blair, for example, at one point was directly asked by Jack Straw to lobby the US government on behalf of Siemens, the telephone company, in order to get a contract in Iraq. You had communications between governments that were skeptical about the invasion. The Russian government, for example, they were told by a high-ranking figure in the Bush administration that if they opposed the invasion, then on the other side they would have problems getting contracts. So it's important to understand that the interest of capital is inextricably linked to the politics and the way the governments behave, more so than ever really in the neoliberal era. But largely these relationships are invisible. Now, where do Iraqis in diaspora fit into this? So
get into that. Let me ask you the question of, now that we're over a decade since the war started, the environmental impact has been massive in Iraq and the world. The health concerns that have arisen from the war and the relationship of these corporate powers being there and building whether it be infrastructures for their businesses to function, or without ethical approach in their building or destruction. Cancer rates rising, as well as the destruction of the educational system for a couple of years, which ripples down into decades and generations of people. Where do we start as Iraqis in the diaspora, with the privilege that we have of being in the position that we're in, to begin to chip away at that monolith?
Well, there's three important victories that I would argue for al-Mujtama al-Madani inside Iraq, and the way in which we as people in Shitat would interact with that is very important, and particularly London as the nucleus that before the occupation played such an important role. You look at the ex-foreign minister, ex-prime minister, vice president, president, all of these people politically organized in London prior to the occupation. Now, if we think about the failure to pass the oil law in 2007. Now, this was one of the things that the US government were essentially blackmailing a government that they saw as precarious at that time. They said to them, if you don't give us this oil law, we will not send you an extra 100 or so thousand US troops to buttress the government at this stage. What happened? We saw Iraqi civil society with a really, really rich and important tradition, which has interacted in a fascinating way with the arts as well, across the last 100 years, fight back and block the passing of the oil law, which was massively important, because what that would have done is acted as a subterfuge to privatize the oil fields. Let's not forget that there's 71 identified oil fields in Iraq and only 24 of them are in use. So we're talking about, if you were to exploit it to its full potential, and if the money was to be adequately distributed in the society, there's no reason why people would be living in the poverty that they are living in. 99% of the government's income is from the oil industry. 74% of Iraq's GDP is from the oil industry. It's mismanaged, whether through corruption or incompetence, or a mix of both. It probably depends on who you ask. But for me, we can't forget three really important victories of Iraqi civil society within Iraq. Number one was blocking the oil law. Number two was blocking the amendment to the personal status law. And this was a law that if it passed, you were in a situation where maybe a child as young as 8 could be married off. Okay? Now this was defeated because of the mobilization of civil society. And its greatest advocates in the Iraqi parliament were people that had been backed and funded by the United States since Clinton's Iraq Liberation Act in 1997. Just to make clear where this hypocrisy about democracy is. And now the third victory, which I think is also something that it would be great for Iraqis here to play a role in, was the passing of the labor law in 2015. So up until that point in 2015, you still had in place the banning on strikes, which had been the previous government had put in 1987. Now, if you're going to establish a democratic society, one of the key tenets of a democratic society is collective bargaining. So the labor law in 2015 was not done out of the goodness of their heart. I'm talking about the political elite, the new political elite. It was done because the civil society demanded it repeatedly. And, it was the first time that sexual harassment, for example, was outlawed at work. And again, as I say, it allowed people to be protected by collective bargainings, even those that weren't part of a union. It allowed people to strike. Let's not forget that US society, only 11% of people in US society are unionized. Only around 24% of people in this society, as it stands today, are protected by agreements that are off the back of collective bargaining. So where is our role? Where do we fit in as people in this equation? Do we fit seamlessly into a role at Chatham House? Because it's there and it exists and it's a choice some people made. Or do we choose to find ways in which we can serve as a bridge in that situation for people trying to come here if that's what they want, or for people struggling to improve their material conditions within? Or more importantly, what I feel is we're at a stage where Britain is the 5th largest economy in the world. By 2050, it's projected to be the 11th largest economy in the world. Along that period of time, it's going to have to come to terms with its former colonies. So the 20 fastest growing economies in the world, not one of them is a European country, and several of them are former British colonies. So what that means is now Britain is having to reconfigure its relationship to other countries in the world and realize its history. You know, I'll never forget when Tony Blair actually did a ceremony to give Hong Kong back to the Chinese. His opposite on the Chinese side said maybe this will go some way to repairing our history. And Tony Blair actually said, I had no idea what he was talking about. Are you saying that a prime minister of this country would not know that in the 1800s, Britain launched 3 wars against the Chinese to force them to legalize opium, so the British could sell them opium?
Well, we both know he was a clouchy, so you know it's
big time clouchy, bro. but the worse than a clouchy, man. Worse than a clouchy.
The British Museum. Spaces like the British Museum they exist in many major metropolises around the world, which are directly connected to funding from corporations like BP or even government funding, and function as these cultural institutions that inherit and conserve the historical past of many of their colonized, their colonies, but also safe spaces for these things to be untouched, right? At the same time, if you sit down and you talk to my father or my uncles, they will tell you, oh yeah, but it's not like our people would have conserved it any better. This is coming from the older generation that existed in Iraq and lived in Iraq and successively saw that the wars came with people that looted specific exhibitions or artwork, and they lost a big part of their history, right? So what is the alternative to, and why has it not been created by the part of our community that might have the financial stability or the ability to fund spaces to have these artifacts conserved in non-privatized businesses like the British Museum?
So what's interesting about the British Museum is it's always been about exclusivizing access. So when it was founded, originally, it was only accessible to a very tiny strata of British society. You just couldn't get in. And then as time progressed, they started opening it up more and more to the public. In terms of what it functions as, it is a vestige. It is one of the kind of some of the residue of a declining empire. And with that process means that there is a lot of people mobilizing to claim back some of those things. So at a time when the consensus in Europe was that the earth was flat, when Oxford scholars were saying bathing was a heathen practice, this is why so much, this is why today NASA name craters on the moon after the moon, name craters on the moon after Ibn Sina, after Khawarizmi as well. There's even a crater on the moon named Mashallah. Why? Because this was a Persian Jew who was studying in Baghdad at the time and was so accomplished in terms of astronomy. And so I think that there is power in, we understand what the British Museum is, but there's also alternative ways to understand history and be empowered when looking at some of the stuff in the British Museum. But of course, as an institution, it will be dismantled. It's not a case of we need to make it change. The natural progression, at the time of the founding of the East India Company, the 2 largest economies in the world were India and China. Where we are now, by 2030, China is going to overtake the United States as the world's largest economy.
Yeah, everything comes back full circle.
Exactly.
And I think it's similar to the idea of karma, or the idea of if they took away our power and our resilience and our sort of our sciences and it's going to come back to them too eventually. I don't know if it'll be in our generation, but
what do you think is what would you say may be the differences between being an Iraqi artist working in Canada and one working in London?
I think the differences in being an Iraqi artist in Canada versus an Iraqi artist to London, obviously the first one would be the proximity to the mother base of colonization, being that the UK is very much, it's been so intrinsically intertwined with the history of Iraq. Canada is also portrays itself as this safe space.
Do you think, as spectators of a suffering, which all of us will render,
Yeah, of course.
there is an element of potentially survivor's guilt?
Yeah, definitely. But I didn't survive anything.
Really? Would you not say that in some way the idea of watching somebody suffer and feeling that you have some type of kinship or affinity to them is also traumatizing in some way?
No, there was huge trauma in the early 2000s to now that we all, a form of, like, I call it like digital PTSD almost, Like I said, the internet became this vehicle for us. You almost want to look away, but you feel guilty looking away, and then you feel guilty watching the suffering, right? So there's this almost devaluing of your life that you're forced into, right? Beyond just looking at numbers like Iraq body count or any of the informational packages that we were receiving about cancer rates rising, and watching the videos of mass murder, of torture, brought me a great sense of despair. And it almost like they almost bombarded us with these images to make us feel like we couldn't do anything about it.
That's what I wanted to ask. Do you feel that guilt is mobilizing or demobilizing?
Depends on the person, right?
Right.
I think it depends on your will. With us, with me and you specifically, I think it mobilized us more than anything. There might have been moments where we felt very disillusioned by even what we were doing. The struggle here is real. Like, it's very, it's intrinsic to the existence of living in this land. Like, you are tied to the exploitation that the nation has created in its attachment to other nations, right? Just like you are in Canada or the States. But here it's so like the beginning, or between the Dutch and the British, it started that relationship almost on a corporate level or a business level or a financial trading level. So I feel like as an artist, you or many of the artists that I know in London that deal with these political realities, there's a certain burden that you have to carry with you that I don't feel in Canada. And then I think the next conversation that's going to be had are these racial inequalities and financial gaps between people that shouldn't exist anymore, for us to sort of exist in not only an ethical way, but in a way that won't be as destructive for the future for our children on a planetary level, but also on a social level, I see with my kids the way they see human beings. It's very simple and might sound corny, but they don't see these lines that are drawn that we began learning at the age of 13 and 14 around race and culture, and right? And that's the core of every human being. If we're able to instill not only the education that's needed for you to understand the histories, but also the fact that these things in the long run shouldn't matter, and having somehow these things meet at a point where they're in their 20s and they start realizing that they can dismantle through the hybridity that exists with the digital existence that they have, then maybe the future will be a better place. But you never know, man. You never know the way it goes. Inshallah khair.
C-I-A-F, we are enter and spy when we